Well, thank you very much, Selena, for that
I'll make
welcome.
up what he's saying.
I'd like to start by extending my thanks to the Secretary for his generous invitation to address you this afternoon. Finn Pratt has impressed me greatly and is one of the most inspiring leaders with whom I've had the pleasure to work. So I'm very delighted to be here and to spend some time with you delivering this address. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, as well as the other owners of the lands across the country where the audience is positioned today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I cannot help, though, in saying that, but reflect on the gap between my opportunities in life and those of too many others who, for a range of reasons, are left out and miss out. I look to the day when this will not be the case, especially for the peoples of our First Nations. I'd also want to acknowledge my colleagues at the Institute, especially my deputies over the years, Alison Moorhead and Matthew Gray, and now currently Sue Tate and Daryl Higgins. So the latter two are here today, and our Assistant Director, Ruth Weston, PSM, who's been a member of staff at the Institute since it was established in 1980. As well, I'd thank all of those with whom I've been privileged to work over my time at AFES. The Institute's a wonderful place with young, bright, energetic, enthusiastic researchers who've made my life very enjoyable. But I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge my long-serving and ever-loyal Executive Assistant, Nancy Vigona, who deserves my special appreciation and recognition for her contributions, including to this address today. I owe a great debt of gratitude to the many people across this department. When I think about it, in a sense, in my tenure as Director of the Institute, the Department of Social Services and the various iterations it's had in the past, from FACS to FACSIA to DSS, have been wonderfully supportive to me, as have all those in the other portfolio departments and agencies with whom I've had the pleasure to work. Collectively, though, it's this department that's shown such a commitment to research and evaluation and has been such a wonderful support to me and to AFES over my time as Director. There are too many of you here and around the country to mention individually, but I would like to beg your indulgence to mention some. Peter Hooter, Jan Lawless and Marion Esler merit mention in dispatches. They've been wonderful links between the Institute and the department, and that's been invaluable. We are only really as good as the extent to which we have connection and partnership. As well, I've also been well served by the executive assistants to secretaries and deputy secretaries and other senior officers of the department. And here I would mention Danuta Kershaw, Carmel Mazza, Deborah Lee Bain, Tracy Kane, Rhonda Wybrow, and many, many others. Some of you are here, so thank you. Now look, when the message was delivered to me that the Secretary would like me to have an opportunity to deliver a valedictory address, I pondered it. I've been associated with several universities in the United States, and I am now on the cusp of a return to academia. I'm well aware of the place that valedictory speeches have in the culture of student life in North America. But I'm somewhat relieved, I think, that we don't have that tradition in Australia. We do now, of course, have the mortarboards thrown in the air and all the other bits, but anyway, I think it's a good thing we don't have it. Now, Serena's already sketched what the parameters for what I was asked to talk about. Insights from my time at AFES and over my career. Useful strategies for promoting lifelong well-being for disadvantaged people and their families. And important research that might be of interest to you. Now, that's a fairly wide sweep. But fortunately, I cut my lecturing teeth at the University of Queensland at a time when the minimum lecture slot was 2 hours. So I'm pleased that you've given me a similar time slot to address you on these three very small topics. So I commence. Anyone who needs to sleep or to leave for whatever reason, feel free to do that, but round about 4:15 I'll be finished. Despite my disparagement of the US tradition of valedictory speeches, in the interests of academic rigour, I thought I should at least research the defining elements of such speeches. And of course, I went to a scholarly source, that wonderfully democratic organ, Wikipedia, and it provided the following insights. The valedictory speech is delivered by the highest ranked student in a graduating class. Well, I don't think that applies to me. And though the choice of speaker is often controversial, and hopefully not so today, Wikipedia went on to conclude that the purpose of such an address is to inspire one's fellows, thank those responsible for one's success, and leaven the speech with youthful frivolity. Now, clearly, the last requirement is one for which I am extremely well qualified. Like a graduating student, I'm now contemplating what I might do when I grow up. My aim, of course, is to be the employment poster boy for the 2065 Intergenerational Report. I also thought it worthwhile to consult some of the other worldly wisdom of the web and found a most valuable template for such a speech. As I'm moving to academia, I'm sure most of my students will consult similar templates. And so, let me have a look at it. The template, over the last, and you have to insert the number, well, it's almost 11 years, I've learnt a lot. But clearly, if it took me 11 years, I'm a very slow learner. Mr., and I could insert here Sullivan, Harmer, Moran, Watt, or Pratt, has taught me to insert some sort of complicated sounding, leadership, management, financial, that person with the phone can leave, strategic, personnel, policy, or personal thing. So I leave it to your imagination as to what I put there. Miss insert Beecham, Carroll, or Bennett, or for that matter, Wilson, has taught me so much, so insert an interesting, dare I say, titillating tidbit here. Mr. insert Kalish, Tune, or Lie, or another widely known funny, popular influence, has taught me, insert something odd or funny that would have surprised my dear departed parents, such as learning to swear in Swahili, or the best way to approach a girl at a dance. Thank you, Michael, that was extremely valuable to me. It goes on to remind one, do make it funny, but revealing, and a little bit embarrassing. Now, those of the aforementioned who have made the unfortunate decision to attend this afternoon will be relieved to know that I've decided to abandon the template, but stick, albeit loosely, to the parameters that the department in its wisdom provided. So enough levity. I now want to consider prevention and early intervention and the roles they've played in my career, as Serena said, and the challenges that I see that they present for policy and practice. As my subtitle suggests, I want to reflect on those two terms, prevention and early intervention, and end by briefly weaving together the three threads of my subtitle, investing, innovating, and interconnecting. Before I get to these, however, let me set the scene and share with you why prevention and early intervention have been such key areas of interest across my career. The focus on these has been a thread that's gone from the time that I first joined the University of Queensland. I went there as a member of staff at the then Fred and Eleanor Chanel Special Education Research Centre. I had the opportunity, which was a rare privilege, to work with the late Professor Betty Watts, OBE. And Betty led the team that completed the first national audit of early intervention programs for children with disabilities. This was a flagship Commonwealth initiative, and it was commissioned as part of the Commonwealth's contribution to 1979, which was, of course, the International Year of the Child. That review, and I mention it because this topic of early intervention and prevention, or prevention and early intervention as I prefer it, has a long history. The review showed that Australia had played a leading part in developing innovative approaches to early intervention. It had really done things that were groundbreaking. applied to children with disabilities, albeit, but with lessons for other areas of public policy and human service. The other interwoven thread is an abiding interest in human development across the life course. Now, this was preceded in my academic studies, but when I moved to the Chanel Centre, it highlighted in the years I was there that the particular diversity of persons and the paths they take through life, and the policy challenge of really recognising diversity and really thinking about how we innovate and tailor programs to address that diversity. To paraphrase two giants of personality theory, Kluckhohn and Murray, every person is A, like all others, B, like some others, and C, like no other. Notwithstanding that easily said three-word classification, there are many powerful myths of uniformity of persons and groups, and they prevail, and they have prevailed, and they continue to do so. We have a tendency to look to the simplifications about groups rather than to think about diversity, complexity, and change. Despite their endurance, these myths belie the experience of our own lives and those of others. Just as types, averages, and myths of uniformity prevail, so too does a belief in the power of prediction. I've been amazed at how human beings love to be able to predict. And I think it's got something to do with our desire to control. And as lovingly my staff refer to me as the fat controller, basically, I think I've fallen prey to that error as well. That belief in prediction, though, says more about the person who holds it than about the actual activity of predicting where lives go. It's about the acuity of hindsight, or what you could technically call retrodiction rather than prediction, than anything about our actual capacity to predict and control. Prediction is an inherently risky phenomenon. After all, change happens both by accident and by design. And you as policymakers and implementers of policy are really there to create change by design. But the outcomes will always be inherently touched by some degree of uncertainty. I've been struck by the inherent paradox in the belief of many of those who work in research, policy and practice that life courses are predictable. Their business, after all, is to ensure that change happens by design. Effective prevention policies, programs and skillfully deployed interventions are only worth the effort if change is possible. So what do I take away from my experience at this vitally formative time in my career? My time at the Chanel Centre taught me three things and gave me three insights. By the way, the template says always use three when you're delivering a speech. The first is that difference is the norm. Change is the constant, and context makes all the difference. So let me turn to these. Difference is the norm. Much of what I learned in my time at the Chanel Centre underscored the rich diversity of those who unfortunately suffer the burden of a category, label, or type. Whether that's related to disability or whether it bears on disadvantage. It was the diversity of those so classified that I found to be far more interesting than their superficial similarities. But attitudes and stereotypical beliefs too often become attached to classifications, categories and types. The slogan that I read from the United Kingdom put it this way: your attitude, my handicap. And it's a nice play when you think about it. In my experience, categories were rarely clear-cut. Like gender differences, the average performance hid considerable variation and overlap in abilities and outcomes. If we measured all our physical strength in this room, I would be sure that most of the women in this room are probably stronger than I am these days. The distributions overlap. It's very rare to find any distribution of a characteristic across gender that doesn't overlap. And yet we separate by being obsessed with the mean. Overlaps were and still are the norm, whether we consider men and women or any other groups of individuals. While averages are useful, variation is much more interesting. Developmental stages also made a difference, and one of our studies showed that in families with a child with a disability, the member most likely to be nominated as the major source of concern by parents wasn't always the child with a disability. It tended to be any adolescent that was in the family, though I must be careful not to stereotype youth. Variation between individuals and groups is merely a starting point. Variability, or the capacity to change, is at the heart of prevention and early intervention and the policies and practices that underpin these. From a policy perspective, of most interest is the extent to which individuals have a capacity to change and under what circumstances. But of course, we differ in our capacity to change too. To be technical for a moment, there is variation in variability, and that's reflected in the changing paths that people take through life. The second of the insights was that change is the constant. Like many slogans, there's 4 words in this slogan too, so it's not political. Change is the constant. It's easily said, but difficult to embrace, particularly in policy and practice, because we do like things to be stable, predictable, orderly. Change occurs both in characteristics of and outcomes for individuals, as well as in their circumstances, and that's why it's difficult to predict. If you only base the prediction on the basis of the person, you don't know necessarily enough about what's happening around them in their context. To give one example, using data from the panel study of income dynamics, Professor Greg Duncan and his colleagues showed the extent of change in financial circumstances in that panel study of income. As Duncan put it, the striking degree of economic turbulence and perhaps genuine mobility at all economic levels were a key feature of the PSID data. The dynamics of mobility are more complex than the static categories of socio-economic status. Duncan's work with the PSID data cast important light on the transitions into and out of poverty, at least in the United States context, and how frequently they occurred. He concluded that only a little more than half of the individuals living in poverty in one year are found to be poor in the next, and considerably fewer than 1/2 of those who experience poverty remain persistently poor over many years. This highlights the dangers of overlooking the volatility of incomes for many in the community. But of course, much of that data, including from the major national surveys of income and labour market dynamics around the world, gives invaluable insight into the white economy. They tend to be silent on the realities of what could be called the grey and the black economies, which in some countries may be of similar magnitude to the legitimate or white economy. We know very little about that. As such, there's a tendency to rely on measures that tend to limit our views of income and income poverty. There are also limits to views of lives as regulated and subject to predictable stages and transitions. As Glenn Elder argues, there are serious limitations in thinking about the life course as a life cycle. Life cycle approaches are not useful because life courses are inherently varied, though to reiterate, a focus on averages hides diversity and difference, as well as the capacity for change. The stages of life are not predictable. Children entering school, for example, there will be a difference of up to 5 or 6 years of developmental age on entry to school. Those who are 5 years ahead of their chronological age will take about 1/5 of the numbers of exposures to new material to learn it, to a child who is in fact 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years behind. We don't think about the way in which the mismatch between developmental age and chronological age applies through life. Without a big digression, I did a lot of work around children with Down syndrome, and there were two peaks for the average age of mothers who gave birth to children with Down syndrome at the time. One was, of course, older mothers, older than 30. The other was women around 22 to 23. The key variable was not chronological age, it was cellular or biological age. And within this room, apart from the youthful ones like me, some of us are extremely aged in terms of our biology. I'm actually 32, but basically, hard life. Biological age varies greatly. There are also the work of Dr. Lisa Shue with her collaborators Matthew Gray, David DeVoe and David Stanton, work that's been undertaken on those who've experienced separation and divorce, shows that poverty can have a different cast depending on the gender, age and life stages and experiences of those studied, with similar events bringing about very different changes in life circumstances. In the case of separation and loss, older women, especially those who did not repartner, were more likely to drift into poverty than younger men and women. The third insight is that context makes all the difference. The key importance of context and the insight into that flowed from reflection on the wide discrepancy between the views of parents of children with disabilities when I was working at Chanel and the professionals' reports about those same children. We would look at the assessments that a parent did and the assessments that a professional did and see that they were in some cases almost unrecognisable. So the way to resolve this was to send observers to directly observe the children at home or in the clinic setting or the educational setting. What we found was both sets of views were accurate. The context set the difference in the view you had of children. It was particularly so if the behaviours of interest were social interaction, language development and communicational behaviours. Children who were almost mute in the clinical setting were voluble at home. And yet the impression that a professional would get and base a program on was very different. The issue, of course, always is whether it's shaping the setting or changing the individual or focusing on both. To that extent, the children we investigated in that study, where they were was more important behaviourally than who they were. And that tends to be the nature of context. You're all sitting very politely here, but I'm sure in other contexts you're not that reticent. Changing historical circumstances also paint the backdrop for each of our lives. Again, as Glenn Elder's work has shown, on the children who experienced the macroeconomic disruptions of the Great Depression, to quote him, it showed the diversity of changes that occurred depending on the complex interplay of factors in the individuals and their families. The fact that you'd gone through the Depression was not predictive of how you would end up and what impacts it would have on your life. It depended on how old you were as a child. It depended on what the nature of the circumstance was that your family experienced, and it depended on their skills to cope and manage. Major events, be they the Great Depression or the global financial crisis, challenge our notions of predictable sequences and highlight differences in vulnerability. I've always been interested in the fact that in times of war, like the Second World War, incidents of community mental health problems went down. Now, maybe they didn't report them, maybe they were too busy avoiding the bombs, but at the end of the day, it's very interesting that sometimes the impact of crisis is paradoxical, and it's because it brings people together. But this does not only, as an insight, apply to times of crisis. To quote Elder, the life course of individuals is embedded and shaped by the historical times and places they experience over their lifetimes. And that's again why a simplistic life cycle approach is not the one that we ought to adopt. As such, one needs to focus on the transforming environment as well as the individual. As Kelly Hand, Jennifer Baxter, Leisha Shue, Laurie Maloney and Ruth Weston at the Institute showed in their work on life events, similar events have very different impacts depending both on who you are and, more importantly, where you are at the particular time of your life. Broadly speaking, however, context can be both powerfully limiting for some and enabling for others. Social address has major impacts, as the following slides illustrate. Some of you will know that this is data from the longitudinal study of Australian children, which I think is one of the most wonderful investments that the department has made, and I think it's just bearing so much fruit. But this is the infants. On the left is the lowest social position, on the right is the highest social position, divided by deciles, every 10%. You can see that those at the lowest social economic position are superficially similar to those at the highest. And those in the middle are sort of bouncing around that mean of 100, which says they're average. But in a sense, numerically, there are as many children at the high socioeconomic position who as infants look as if their developmental outcomes basically are somewhat compromised. Look what happens by the time of 2 to 3. The children in the lowest socioeconomic position have fallen considerably behind, and the children at the highest position have accelerated, and you have a nice, clearly developing gradient in the data. And that's all happened in the space of the first 3 years of life. So you can see why the focus on early intervention is so important at that stage. But it's not the whole story. By 4 to 5, it's increased even further. So on the cusp of school, as I said, children are starting school at very different positions in terms of their developmental age and their developmental capacities. By 6 to 7, these are now entrenched. And by 8 to 9, there's not much change. So the differences that emerged early in life. Now, I do add methodologically, these, by the time you get to 8 to 9, are 2 cohorts, but we can repeat the analysis looking at a single cohort. I just haven't done that. Social address, therefore, does have major impacts. Elders' work also highlights the ability of families to adapt when given opportunities, choices, and capacity to exert agency over their lives. Emmy Werner is a giant in longitudinal research. Her work in the Kauai longitudinal study in Hawaii, which looked at very disadvantaged Hawaiian families, showed some, if not many of those growing up in very disadvantaged settings demonstrate a remarkable capacity to overcome their circumstances and to achieve in spite of their adversities. And within the same family, the outcomes for children in superficially similar circumstances of disadvantage are quite remarkably different. Resilience is a state of adaptation in the face of challenge, and disadvantage is better viewed as a state that can be changed rather than an immutable life circumstance. The key to policy intervention is the unswerving belief, as I said before, that change is possible. Of course, as I've argued above, some may be more open to change than others. Typically, this is a product of person and context in combination. The interaction of genes, environments, and experiences shape behaviour in its life course. So disadvantage is better, in my argument, thought of as a state that varies considerably with social address and with the life histories of individuals and their families. Many of the effects are complex and span generations. This is work that Kirsten Hancock, Ben Edwards and Steve Zubrick have done using wave 4 of LSAC. Now, it's a complicated slide, but what I would highlight is look at the difference between the dark blue bars and the light blue bars on the right. And these are for the mothers and the fathers. We won't drill down to that level, but it shows what's happened if you have no member of your family who's been jobless one member of your family, that's of your parents' generation who've been jobless, or two generations who've been jobless. A member in your grandparents, your parents who've been jobless. What you can see is the impact on outcomes, for example, in literacy, is quite marked. And for those who've had no history, they are above the average. For those who've had that experience of one, or worse still, two generations of joblessness, the impacts on learning, and particularly literacy in this case, are very clear. The same goes for numeracy. And the same also goes for socio-emotional problems. Interestingly, though, other work that Ben Edwards has done shows very clearly that boys are much more affected socio-emotionally in early life than girls. Girls are resistant to those sorts of negative impacts to a greater extent than boys, and that's a very interesting outcome, I think. And it does go to the frailty of us blokes. Right, moving on. Susceptibility, though, to genetic and environmental influences is a complex process. And that susceptibility really does vary across individuals. Research on differential susceptibility is rapidly developing with wide implications for many disciplines. Susceptibility, as I said, to environmental influence varies considerably among children. Those with a difficult temperament, for example, have been shown to exhibit more behaviour problems when experiencing low-quality childcare. Hardly surprising. But surprisingly, fewer problems when exposed to high-quality childcare. So in other words, the same child will be much more susceptible and sensitive to a negative experience, but also more malleable when put into a high-quality environment. And again, it's why childcare quality matters. As such, they are more likely to be influenced for good or for ill, depending on the quality of their developmental context. Children who have difficult temperaments, and I'm sure none of you have got children with difficult temperaments, have also shown to be more susceptible to negative maternal discipline and to show fewer externalising problems if they're exposed to positive maternal discipline, which is another reason why parenting interventions do work, if they can change the nature of the environment that parents create for children. And finally, a study of attachment security provided support for the differential susceptibility hypothesis. With those children who show insecurity, distress and avoidance, which we in the trade call disorganised attachment, being more susceptible to unfavourable care environments, but responding positively to favourable ones. Quality matters. Consistency matters. And it matters differently for some children as opposed to others, because some are much more susceptible to negative impacts, but they, reassuringly, are likely to be more open to positive effects and influences. These findings demonstrate the links between the genetic substrate and differential susceptibility to environmental experience. A relationship has also been established between a specific gene that underpins differential susceptibility to maltreatment and the propensity to move from being a victim to a victimiser. Those, and I have to bore you with it, but with the high levels of expression of monoamine oxidase A, MAOA in the trade, that gene, if you possess it, was shown to be protective. You were less likely, in the face of maltreatment, to victimise others. Those with low levels of that gene, of course, were much more likely to become victimisers, having suffered maltreatment. So the same life event will have a very different outcome depending on the genetic substrate of the person who experiences it. And that makes the issue of how you intervene even more complicated and begs the question of what sort of data will we use in time to be able to sensitively target those children who will benefit most. In part, this illustrates the complex links between early experience and development and health and well-being across life. So I'd better go on to early intervention and prevention. Now, if I had to say what was one thing in my career that really stood out, it was the opportunity to work with a team, with Jacqueline Goodnow and Ross Hommel and others, that published Pathways to Prevention. It was published on the cusp of a new millennium, and the report has had a major impact on thinking about prevention and early intervention, not only in Australia but more widely. Prevention is increasingly associated with early intervention, and the two are now typically used in combination in the policy and practice discourses. As Helen Buckley recently observed in Melbourne last week, in fact, they're very fuzzy constructs. So let me attempt some differentiation. Prevention involves planned and organised efforts directed to reducing the likelihood of potential problems. It seeks to reduce the overall incidence and prevalence of risk. From a pathways perspective, prevention seeks to lower the overall likelihood of negative outcomes and increase the incidence of positive pathways. Early intervention seeks to alter an emergent or established pathway. It starts with evidence of risk in terms of the individual's characteristics and/or circumstances, or more typically as a result of a membership of a group that's held to be at risk. And we're not that precise in identifying the groups that are at risk, given what I've argued about the variation that you'll have within any group. Social address makes a big difference to risk, as the following slide illustrates. Now, there's some data that show you for the financially disadvantaged group, which is the solid line, and the dotted line, which is the not financially disadvantaged subsample of LSAC. What you see is if you're not financially disadvantaged, typically you will have none, 1, 2, or perhaps 3 risk factors in your life if you've drawn a particularly poor hand. In contrast, if you're financially disadvantaged, you'll typically have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 risks in your life. Now, it shows why an intervention focused on a single area may have really powerful results if you have a child who's not financially disadvantaged. If you have one who's disadvantaged, broad spectrum or multi-spectrum interventions are needed. And yet we tend to think of these things in unidimensional senses. We'll just fix the parenting. We'll just fix the education. We'll just fix the health. But if you're in that financially disadvantaged group, you often get the full Monty. And I think there's a sense in which it's why we need to innovate around the development of a much richer suite of programs and initiatives. Okay. Early intervention can be seen as a subset of prevention. And a classification that you'll all be aware of is the 1957 one, which still hangs around, for primary classification, secondary prevention, and primary prevention. And primary prevention occurs prior to the recognition of a disease. Secondary prevention takes place once the disease has been identified, and tertiary prevention is added to capture the effort that occurred to reduce the likelihood of further deterioration in those suffering the disease. Now, suits disease very nicely, but disadvantage isn't a disease. Another conceptualisation is less disease-oriented, and that's that you have universal prevention. This is the classic public health model, and they're efforts that are available to the whole population. Broad spectrum, it's like giving antibiotics to every chook. Selective prevention is for a population subgroup that's identified as at risk, and indicated preventions for those who have identified problems or are high risk for developing a problem. In this scheme, the term early intervention is a class of indicated prevention. So it's at the top of the pyramid, which I'll show you in a moment. Irrespective of the framework adopted, early intervention is a generic term for planned and organised attempts to alter the behaviour or development of individuals who show the early signs of an identified problem and who are considered at high risk or are considered at high risk for developing the problem. Pathways to prevention address the developmental interventions in 2 senses. The first was early in life, and the second was early in the pathway to a problem. In terms of the first sense, early in life, it's been too successful. It's clearly resonated with a singular interest in early childhood. And having occupied a chair of early childhood, I'm about to speak some heresy. This interest has been stimulated by growing evidence of the effects of early experience on brain development, especially in the first 3 years of life. And you can't deny a vast amount of brain development happens very early in the first 3 years of life. Happens prenatally, by the way, too. But we don't tend to think about that. In considering the new brain research, of most significance are the links between abuse and neglect in brain development, and that these may have their impacts across life. Despite the fact that the most compelling evidence relates to abuse and neglect, the findings are generalised now to everyone. So everybody should have the high quality intervention, irrespective of whether it's going to be cost effective or even give you much of an increase over the stimulating environment in which that child is. And that's my argument later in the talk for targeting. Less well understood is the extent of neural plasticity and the constraints on these and the scope for neurological change across life, including in adolescence. I think the only time when you don't get neurological change as a human being is when you're dead. So when you think about it, we really have a view that is extremely stage-centric and not really thinking about the fact that early intervention is something that's better applied to a life course. There's the model of prevention, which I didn't show you, but you can see from universal to indicated, and the top of it should be intensive early intervention, and the base basically is the other. Now this is the development of the brain, or at least one aspect of it. This is the synaptic development, the connections you form. And of course, much of what happens, apart from the fact, if you look at the straight lines, that's myelination, that's the sheath around the dendrites, and the synaptic connections being made happens in that early part. You can see prenatally, cell migration is occurring between 6 and 24 years of prenatal age, weeks of prenatal age, and it goes through intensively up to 12 months. But then when you get to years and decades, it's still going. Of course, part of what happens to children is it's the pruning of the connections. The millions of connections that are pruned to make the brain work more efficiently, and that's a function of experience. Every brain in this room is unique. There are no two brains at the cellular level that are identical because you have each shaped and pruned your brains uniquely as a function of experience. If we looked at other aspects of neural development, you'd find they go on right through life, dare I say, even to the ripe old age that I've achieved. And plasticity of development is fascinating. We now can examine a brain and watch the connections being formed and unformed. We can watch the functions of a brain that's had a stroke be transferred and migrate to another area of the brain to compensate. And with physiotherapy and other occupational therapy, see the functions transfer back to the area that was originally injured, provided intervention starts early enough. Importantly, environmental risk is not destiny. Were that to be the case, then early intervention would not be worth pursuing. Similarly, genetic research also shows that DNA is not destiny. So if experience is not destiny and environmental risk isn't, and if DNA isn't destiny, well, what's going on? Environmental and genetic predispositions are involved in a complex dance. The reality is much more complex than the rhetoric of nature versus nurture. Some of these interactions are epigenetic. They happen above the genome. And Lamarck was right. Change in one generation is mapped onto the genome and transferred, not through genetic change, but through epigenetic change. It's a relatively new field that I think is extremely exciting. And epigenetics highlights the manner in which environmental experiences influence the expression of genes in ways that span generations. The experiences of previous generations mark the genome of current generations and influence the expression of genes in subsequent generations. For example, famine in one generation, followed by abundance of food for another, affects the risk of obesity and heart disease across generations. To this extent, I am what my grandparents and parents ate, and that assuages some of my guilt. For each individual, however, experience throws the switch. To that extent, I am unfortunately also what I eat. Since the publication of Pathways to Prevention, I've reflected on the relative lack of interest from researchers, policy makers and practitioners in prevention and early intervention in the second sense of addressing pathways that start later in life, at later points in the life course. I say it's relative because, of course, there are many who have remained focused on developmental stages other than the early years, but they've struggled to have their voices heard. Some developmental epochs, such as middle childhood, still continue to be largely unexplored, if not overlooked. And while adolescence is of growing interest, adulthood is still too often relegated to being merely an endpoint, rather than a time of major developmental change in its own right. If the view that we'll live to 150 is correct, and I intend to prove that correct, then what we will find is we'll better know a heck of a lot more about processes of ageing and processes of cellular ageing and processes of chronological age across time, because they've all shifted. In 1920, in London, in the major hospitals, it was unusual to see a person that was much older than 60. And if you saw a person who was in their 30s or 40s, photographically, they looked like a person who's in their 50s, 60s or 70s today. The pace of change has been remarkable in terms of the prolongation of life. Both prevention and early intervention can also be focused on enhancing strengths, amplifying protective factors and enriching the available pathways. Typically, this will be through provision of access to experiences that compensate for disadvantage, vulnerability, and that shift adverse life circumstances. Often the focus will simultaneously be on reduction of the negative and enrichment of the positive. And parenting programs are a nice example of that, because they typically do focus on reducing negative behaviours that are related to harsh, coercive, or inconsistent parenting, but at the same time seek to enrich parents' sense of competence, confidence, and positive parenting capacity. By the implementation of well-designed initiatives, prevention and early intervention offer the potential to address and overcome a wide range of problems in development, health, learning, behaviour and wellbeing. They have a capacity to address simultaneously a range of factors that may have negative short and longer term impacts. They also can have multiple impacts on multifaceted problems because, as Lober says, problems tend to cascade. Prevention and early intervention are compelling notions that are easily grasped by lay and professionals alike, and that's part of their problem. They're simplistic and they're overextended, and they're not really understood in terms of the nuances and sophistication that makes policy in this area difficult to implement. Easy to say, difficult to enact. Two questions are the keys, I think. One's the timing question. Which problems require action when, over what time frame, where and with whom? The second is the sustainability question. How are the gains to be maintained? So the timing's one part of it and the sustainability one, because there's a lot of magical thinking around this area. Lober's highlighted the developmental ordering of problems across the span from early intervention. Difficult temperament, for example, hyperactivity and overt conduct problems and aggressiveness appear early in childhood. Withdrawal, poor peer relationships and academic problems are more likely to show their face in primary school years. And covert or concealing conduct problems, association with deviant peers, they appear much later. It's interesting, if we think of the radicalisation problem, we're not thinking about the radicalisation of 3-year-olds. We're thinking of a point at which conduct problems, association with deviant peers, attraction to causes is the thing. The developmental stacking of behaviours suggests that multiple points for intervention and ultimately addressing vulnerability will be the function of the number of risks, as I've argued earlier. Very quickly, the Australian Temperament Project, which is conducted in partnership between Melbourne University, Deakin University and the Institute, shows some really interesting things. Work's been done looking at the precursors of risky driving behaviour, alcohol use, essentially substance misuse, over 30 years. And it shows things like, if you want to look at substance misuse at the age of 15 and 16, some of the precursors in that group were discernible in infancy. In contrast, persistent antisocial behaviour only became noticeable in the primary school years. And anxiety, interestingly, for boys, appeared by the age of 3, when they were reported to be more anxious and more likely to be seen as shy. Anxiety in girls only became apparent at 11 to 12 years of age. The data also show the complexity of timing and the form of pathways into, out of, or resistant to depression. And that's the pattern across the sample. The bottom line is the stable low group, no risk, not at high risk of depression at any stage, between 13 to 24 over a 10-year period. The red bar, or the red line, is the stable high group. But then there's a group that showed a decreasing pattern, and there's a group that showed an increasing pattern, and there's a group that showed moderate to low risk. The one group of children and young people and young adults have very different pathways. Collectively, these results lend weight to the view that the timing of interventions would differ across problems, given that intervention, in contrast to prevention, can only occur when the indicators of problem become discernible. And this brings me to the sustainability question. If the timing of interventions to alter different pathways is problematic, then the sustainability of effects is another order of magnitude. This begs the question, how are gains to be maintained? And a lot of the research really does show high effect sizes for interventions early after the intervention, but effects wash out. There's a compelling critique that Jean Brooks-Gunn provides of what might be called the early childhood error, the belief that all is evident and active, in some instances in latent form, in early life, and therefore remediable then, if only we had the knowledge. Not everything starts in early childhood. I'm reminded of Michael Rutter's book, 15,000 Hours. 15,000 hours the time you spent at school. Now, sadly, may be different for you, but not everything that I experienced at school has been retained. So 15,000 hours of investment, and the residue, is not a one-to-one correlation with that. As Arnold Samaroff observes, developmental achievements are rarely sole consequences of immediate causes and rarely sole consequences of earlier events. Outcomes are influenced by the interpretation of events, and these in turn change over life. Sarah Wise and colleagues showed that the measured effects of early childhood interventions in a project they did at the Institute, the measured effects were mostly limited to the immediate and the short term. There's a need to research the factors and processes that can be influenced by policy to sustain the effects of early intervention and prevention. And these factors are important mediators and moderators of the impacts of experience. Reflection, like I'm indulging in today, is of course typically a view in life's rear vision mirror. But what of the future? That brings me to the three terms in my subtitle at last. Investing. I think the focus on prevention and early interventions has been driven by a realisation, of course, that they offer to make economic as well as social policy sense. And I love the title of a 2000 report from the UK government, said it all. Early intervention. It's they're very flat and factual, the Brits. Sound investment, massive savings. And that's the story. The Nobel laureate James Heckman's work's been a profound influencer of thinking in this area. But his maxim is easily said. Policy should prevent rather than remediate. So that's what you've got to do. Go forth and prevent, don't bother with remediation. Unfortunately, in the best of all possible worlds, that would be the case. But stuff happens, and as I've argued, more so to some rather than others. Now, I'm not an economist and never will be a Nobel laureate, but it's always struck me that the assumptions of Hickman's argument are a tad simplistic. Of course, investing early, like accumulating superannuation balances, is better if one begins early. But the life course is not that simple. And like the stock market, it's difficult to predict the next apple, dare I say, that will fall from the tree and bear such lucrative long-term financial fruit. As Duncan and Van Del argue, the time values of dollars also needs to be taken into account. I'd add opportunity cost and wastage. Wastage particularly if investments are not well targeted. Heckman's most widely cited work is on the cost-effectiveness of cognitive interventions early in life, and it actually focuses on a highly targeted initiative, the peri-preschool program, and that involved a clear focus on a small group of children and families, providing an innovative, broad spectrum of services and supports that brought considerable benefits. It focused on their multiple problems and demonstrated in the ways in which their effects could be sustained. Heckman's writings on early childhood tend to overshadow his other work, though, on the cost-effectiveness of interventions in the middle years and early adolescence. And this places the focus on initiatives to develop and sustain young people's attitudes, aspirations and values that promote their achievements in education, employment and other areas of life success. The key insight, though, is that from Heckman's work for me, is the focus on targeting to identify those who are most at risk of long-term disadvantage and where investment is most likely on the evidence at hand to reap long-term life course dividends. His work, albeit less emphatically, shows the need to tailor investments to the needs that present across the life course. Duncan's work also illustrates along with Duncan's work also demonstrates this, and the examples I briefly presented related to the work of researchers at the Institute. Investments need to be, in my argument, to summarise, in early life if you're going to prevent neurological damage, cognitive deficit and socio-emotional disturbances. In middle childhood, to promote educational attainment, health, pro-social behaviour and positive adaptive attitudes and aspirations. In early adulthood, to prepare for relationship stability, positive parenting and family well-being, and across the lifespan, in other words. So a focus on one age is not really going to be where one needs to be. The investment approach such as that embraced by the New Zealand government sees targeting in a much more sophisticated light. Linked and skillfully integrated and analysed data can be used to select the target groups for investment, and the portfolio, in inverted commas, is adjusted in the light of the evidence provided by analysis of data, provided through sources such as the integrated data infrastructure and also the longitudinal studies they have. Of course, in a single jurisdiction, it's easy to do some things like link health, education, income, social support, employment and justice data. And I think you need the last one to be linked if you're really going to address some of the problems of those who are really at high risk. We can also achieve such a powerful platform, and much effort is currently being deployed to achieve that end. I think the commitment of this department to data linkage and the capacity of our institute as a linking authority can be synergised to advance the cause, and that's a paid commercial. Such data offer the potential for better targeting, timing and identification of windows of opportunity and ports of entry for prevention and intervention. They also give you a basis for monitoring and really modifying and improving practice. To reiterate, while Pathways of Prevention was a landmark, it really had most success in communicating about early in life, but not as much success about pathways that begin later in life. Income poverty early in life seems to have most profound impacts, according to Duncan, And the Job Training Partnership Act in the USA highlights the differential impacts depending on age and gender of those who participated in income supplementation. Not surprisingly, the largest effects were for single adult women with young children, and the effect sizes of well-targeted broad spectrum interventions are likely to be greater for those in disadvantage. This graph shows the benefits may actually be greater for disadvantage. This is the impact of the Infant Health and Development Program treatments on age 3 IQ by income and birth weight. On the left is income. Actually, the most disadvantaged showed the biggest effect size of income supplementation. If you took birth weight as the measure, the highest results were those, of course, with higher birth weights. Now, there is a correlation between birth weight and social class, but disadvantage, broadly put, will be much more tractable and amenable if you also focus not only on the intervention, but how it maps to programs of targeted income support. Almost there. I had a dentist once who would constantly say that, and he was an arrogant liar. Like so much in life, timing and context are keys to success. If you take another example, the work of Petch in Brisbane shows that if you're going to deliver relationship supports, probably the best timing is, and the best place to do it, is in maternity wards, when parents are primed to receive the information, when quality of relationship is really important because they've got a new life to care for jointly. Investments that are less sensitively targeted and timed are unlikely to develop the hoped-for returns. In terms of constrained public sector resourcing, this is imprudent. It's imprudent to keep pumping money out in the name of prevention and early intervention that isn't targeted. Innovating is my second bit. As a generalisation, children in home environments that are adverse are more likely to benefit from intervention, though it's not quite that simple. To quote Duncan, the heterogeneous nature of poverty demands a heterogeneous set of policies to address the needs they can create. The key is to find the combinations of intervention elements that achieve a targeted fit between interventions and outcomes. And this will vary by stage and context. Here's the impact of earning supplements again. This is a program that looked at earning supplements and school achievement. The impacts were actually most effective up to the age of 5 in having an impact on school achievement. They had limited impacts from 6 to 9, and they actually had a negative impact from 10 to 11, which I find quite fascinating. So the timing of intervention is vitally important, and the targeting also. So as I've reflected on my first brush with prevention and early intervention, I've been struck by the diversity of initiatives that Watts back in 1979 found in Australia. They were tailored, targeted, and in many instances provided broad spectrum support for families. Projects elsewhere, and this is another plug, such as the Caravan project at the Family Action Centre at the University of Newcastle, were similarly groundbreaking. And there are continuing areas of innovation, program innovation. The need now is to move beyond the suite of established programs that we have at the moment that can constrain innovation by their manualised focus on strict fidelity, that can limit capacity for the types of tailoring and targeting that will be essential if we're going to create the next generation of bases for investment in intervention. Shonkoff and Fisher last year make this argument most cogently. To quote them, beyond the development of new ideas, breakthrough impacts on the lives of children and their parents will demand a significant clinical shift in the way research, policy and practice interact in the fields of health and learning, as well as in adult-focused poverty alleviation. Time has precluded thinking about intergenerational intervention approaches, and at a bare minimum, I think you need 2 generational approaches. I think we've got to the point where simply intervening with children is necessary but not sufficient. The department's implementation of the Families and Children's Expert Panel is a great start to make available to the community sector a broad range of current evidence-based practice, as well as program design and evaluation expertise, is an essential support for community sector organisations. My hope, however, is that it also stimulates innovation that involves better targeting of interventions framed against the background of big data. This capacity to provide better data analysis is going to be fundamental. It promises to provide an exciting base for the next generation of prevention and early intervention. Interconnecting, I'll make 2 quick points. Interconnecting for me has 2 senses. One is it's connecting across the life course. One of my students and I did some work around children who'd been in intensive early intervention for children with disabilities. When they got to school, very little information went with them. The school started to assess them as if they'd come for the first time into the space, whereas there'd been 5 years of intervention in some cases. In many instances, there's not good connection of intervention at one effort, at one period in life, and the efforts that will follow. Scant connection with the interventions and supports that followed children as they moved into school was the norm. The other thing, of course, is that connection is about what we now do, which is to say more connected, interdisciplinary approaches. Early intervention presents itself as a time of, as an area that's strongly interprofessional, but the rhetoric does not always match the reality. I think it's much improved now than it was when I first started looking at this. A personal triumph of mine, just to quickly indulge you, was to convince the Dean of Medicine at the University of Queensland of the importance of interprofessional education. And he was most enthusiastic, and he allowed me to have a 1-hour slot on the topic in a 6-year medical course. It was a powerful contribution to medical education, of which I'm justly proud. Interconnection's not a matter of admonitions to professionals to go forth and collaborate. There's much more to do if the efforts not only to be successful, but scalable and above all sustainable. At present, the latter two, scale and sustainability, are wicked problems. That said, I see this as an exciting time for the field. The recognition across governments of the power of prevention and early intervention provides an impetus to embrace new and exciting ways to create the next generation of targeted, interconnected and innovative programs. Now, very quickly, and I know time is running out, basically AFES, it's been my privilege to guide the development of what is really a specialised boundary organisation that spans research, policy and practice. And I really thank the department for the continuing and sustained contribution to sustaining the Institute as a boundary organisation. We're a funny little place, and like the boundary organisations, we really need to effectively scan the horizon, and the ongoing interaction with you has been vital to that. The initiative to have regular meetings with the department's been invaluable to us at the Institute. Like the Boundary Rider, the next generation of prevention and early intervention initiatives will call for the capacity not only to appreciate the immediate terrain, but to have an adventurous and, dare I say, courageous eye to the future. Now to conclude, I'm pleased and indeed touched and honoured to have had this opportunity to reflect on some topics that have formed the warp and weft of the tapestry of my career to this point. The Latin origins of the word valedictory are interesting. They come from 2 words, vale and dicere, and they translate as to say farewell. It's been very good, thanks to Finn Pratt, to have this opportunity to deliver my own vale, and you couldn't walk out on it, or most of you didn't. I find the invitation to deliver one's own vale far preferable to waiting for the less appealing post-mortem versions delivered by others. So all that remains is to say farewell, to extend my thanks to all of you and to so many others who have made my time as the Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies a very large, enjoyable and most memorable part of a fortunate life. Thank you very much.